What's going on, guys, and welcome back to this episode of DM in the PM. My name's Tom Quinn, resident dungeon master here at Modern Myth, and I'm joined by a very special guest today, Matt from Roleplay Chat. Thanks for sitting down with me, brother. How's it going?
Hey, I'm great. Thanks for having me, Tom. I'm really looking forward to dissecting some Dungeons and Dragons and Game Master strategies.
Yeah,
I'm
man.
also
Yeah.
very happy to be back on YouTube. It's been about 2.5 years since I've been on YouTube, so this is going to be a good time.
I'm honored that your return to the space is through
Yeah.
Modern Myth here, so I appreciate that. And I guess we should probably let the people at home know precisely what it is we're getting into. We're going to be talking a little bit today about fundamentally, I guess, world building, but we're going to hopefully try to slant that, give it a little bit of an eye towards what we can be doing as DMs, GMs, whatever acronym you go by, to build spaces that really encourage players to express themselves through role play. Is that a fair synopsis, you think, of where
Yeah,
we're
that
going with this?
perfect. I love that, Tom. That's perfect. I'm
Sweet.
ready to dive right in. Roleplay is my bread and butter. It's the pillar of the game that I like the most. So everything I do always kind of starts with that lens. So I'm really excited to explore that with you today.
Very cool, man. Well, I'm just going to pitch it straight over your direction. I think I certainly, there's content on our channel. People have an idea of the way I think about world building, but I would love to just kind of kick it off from that space. Where do you start when you're thinking about world building, and maybe what are the factors that might change the way you're thinking about world building, depending on from table to table or system to system, those types of things. But just kind of let's kick it off from there. Where's your head at when you first start designing a space for awesome adventures to play out in?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess I'll start with a caveat, and I'll say the thing that everybody has to say because I feel like it's important. And it's that world building is what you make it. You have fun with it, make it enjoyable for you, make it enjoyable for your table, and take everything I'm going to say from this point on, and I'm sure everything that Tom says from this point on with that grain of salt. You know, you're playing this game to optimize your fun. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. But for me, I love world building. I almost exclusively ran or have run all of my games in homebrewed settings. Every now and then I've dabbled and I've played the odd one shot or the odd pre-written adventure module set somewhere that exists. That's been written by, Wizards of the Coast or Chaosium or whoever, you name it. They wrote some kind of module.
Right.
But I love world building. I love creating spaces. And to answer the first part of your question, where does my head go first when I have to think about world building? It's almost always to a map. Almost every single time, I pull out a piece of paper, I draw a map, or I pull up some kind of random map generator and just keep pushing generate until I see something that strikes inspiration in me. I do realize that that's very personal to me, and I want to say that you don't need to have a big space to be world building. You can be, quote unquote, world building a village. You can be, quote unquote, building a forest. But for me, it usually starts with the physical geography of a space. And that's what I'm going to consider to be the first pillar of world building.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
How about yourself?
I certainly think I don't know if that's the first place that I go, but I absolutely think that so much about understanding that geography, understanding another guest that I've had on Dungeon Masterpiece. He has a geopolitics series for all sorts of settings, cool. Which really kind of lends itself to that thought process. Is you can't really begin to understand the conflicts that exist in a space if you don't first understand that space. And obviously a visual tool like a map, I think definitely helps. I think it's probably in the list of, or in the small toolbox that I grab for, initially when I'm kind of, I'm not sure if I start more with the space or I start more with a conflict and design a space that could accommodate that conflict. But whatever the case is, I mean, it's clearly a vital tool. I think there are many DMs who are nodding their heads right now with regard to the idea of having some visual representation so you can begin to outline the entities that are going to exist there, those hotspots. But I'm going to keep it pitched over in your direction, brother, because they don't want to hear from me. They're here to hear from you. So you've got your map. Now, is there a general scale that you are beginning with? I mean, do you go straight to world map, or do you tend to focus on a region or a small area and work out? I tend to think in concentric circles, so that's why I'm asking.
Yeah. Well, for me, most of my world building lately, in the past 4 or 5 years now, has been in the same world, in a homebrew setting that I've created. And because I already have a general sense of how big my space is, when I'm kickstarting a new area, I'm gonna zoom in to the village level. One town, maybe 2 or 3 days on foot out from that town, and I'm going to start an adventure there, whether it be a one shot or something. I'm going to throw myself into that circle. If I abstract myself a little bit and say I don't have a world already to play in, you're telling me to start from zero, I think I would probably do the same thing. I think I would probably pick a small scale. We're talking like I said, maybe a circumference of 5 days, a diameter of about 5 days walking distance.
Right.
And just kind of have that area figured out. And then as we play the game at the table, as things come to light, I'm going to be adding more. I'm going to find myself reaching for information about maybe the traveling tradesman or the caravan that's coming to town or whatever. Or a deity that, there's an old abandoned temple somewhere, and I got to figure out who the deity is, et cetera, et cetera. So it kind of spider webs out from that center, if that makes sense.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I can absolutely relate to that nucleation point and kind of a work outwards.
Mm-hmm.
I tend to find something I actually was just thinking about. I hadn't really considered leading up to this conversation. I'm not sure why. You were talking about this kind of idea of starting an adventure somewhere, and kind of the world in some regard. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I know for me, in some regards, the world begins to kind of reveal itself to me, or at least reveal itself in color to me as the party begins reaching in that direction. I mean, there's oftentimes, the world, I guess I would say it is a so thoroughly modified Faerun that it's not really. I mean, there'd be a lot of purists who would look at our world and go like, that's not the Forgotten Realms. Like, what are you guys doing? But I certainly don't want to take credit for the core of that design, but everything I've run that has been in the fantasy space, I run some sci-fi campaigns that obviously aren't, but have been in that same world, and even sometimes in close relation from a timeline. And I find so many cases running a small 3 or 4 level campaign somewhere else in the world is precisely how I build that portion of the world. I let the players kind of move towards what they think is interesting, and I need to start painting the color into those spaces. So I love that idea of starting nucleated and working out as the party demands it of you.
Yeah, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but maybe I will. I think taking that kind of approach to world building is exactly one of the ways that you're going to facilitate roleplay at your table. And the reason I say that is we're going to take the opposite scenario. Let's say you have a world map and every inch of it is filled in, and there's no room for any kind of creative freedom or adaptation. You're going to have something really fleshed out, sure. But the problem you're probably going to encounter is that your players might find themselves interested in something that isn't available to them because the world you've created dictates it to be so. That's not what you want. If you want your players to be role-playing, putting on the skin of their character, and whether it be doing voices or describing their actions in third person or a mix of the two, you want them to be invested in the space. And the best way for them to be invested in the space is to have things that they want there. whether that
right.
be things that they're asking for or things that you're kind of inferring based on the way that they're playing the game. So if you leave things, like you're saying, in black and white, or even in like some kind of mist until they need to get there,
Right.
you're giving yourself the creative liberty to paint it in the colors that your players are going to react to and be engaged with the most. And
Right,
that's gonna spark role play, like, for sure, any day of the week. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I love that, and I think that feedback loop kind of that you're describing of being able to read your table, especially if, I mean, there are many DMs out there who I'm sure are just starting out with their players or just starting out, period. But if you've been playing with a group of players for a long time, and I mean to the point where you know what makes them tick and what motivates them, what inspires them at the table, having, like you said, that agility to be able to be able to clear that mist away, and what happens to be over in this area is speaking to precisely what, and I might even go so far as to move away from the player at this point, precisely what that character needs to help them flesh out something that's transpiring within their character arc or what have you. So no, I absolutely love that. And I don't think it's too soon at all in the conversation. I mean, like I said, if we start getting into the space of inspiring role play, because I do think that there's a lot of people out there who are addressing world building.
Yeah.
I in thinking about this conversation, was just looking around for like how many people are specifically talking about ways that you can till more fertile soil in those worlds. And I haven't been able to find much. Certainly anyone watching who is like, no, there's tons of it, it's right here, drop that in the comments. I'd love to check it out. But so yeah,
it won't be as good as what we have to say, Tom.
Oh, I mean, it can't be. It can't be. No, I'd love to see it if it's out there. I'm sure that there is some out there. But so no, I don't think there's any issue with beginning to pivot in that direction at any point. But so you're spider webbing your way out, and we've kind of dipped our toes now into what the real crux, the real nugget, I think, of this conversation is. Do you find that, let's say, pre-getting that feedback from your players, so you're literally just kicking things off, and maybe we'll take it a step further, that these are players that maybe you don't inherently know what's going to drive them, what's going to motivate them. Do you find that when you're building your world, that first hook that's really going to pull them into this space, do you find that there are constants, some ways in which you can frame the start of an adventure that have paid dividends regularly for you, or do you find kind of mixing it up and keeping it loose is of equal value in the context of trying to drive, or in some cases for players who maybe aren't as apt to dive into that space, coax that role playing out a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think I'm pretty well equipped to answer that because I find myself often running games these days for people who've never played role-playing games before. And their introduction to what a role-playing game is often Dungeons and Dragons through, like, I don't know, Stranger Things. They're like, it was on Stranger Things. I wanna try.
Right.
And that's a beautiful place to start. I couldn't, like, I'm not throwing shade. I want everybody to play this game and these systems.
Right.
But often they don't really feel necessarily comfortable to role play. They might be a little bit embarrassed. So I find the best way in your world building to kind of suss out role play from people who are new is to give them a lot of options. Give them a lot of different characters that are, maybe one person's more scheming and conniving, and one NPC is going to be very much the perfect good soldier who's going to listen to all of the, like, tropes. Give them all the tropes and see in the little sandbox of this, like, nucleus that you've created, have just enough, maybe 4 or 5 kind of directions and characters that the players can engage with. And in doing this, you're giving them this opportunity to kind of choose their own adventure, if you will. And from there, you can be like, okay, they really want to solve some mysteries. That's what I'm going to be able to engage them in. And again, I'm going to fall back to that. Whatever, like, to get role play, you need to have your players engaged. You need to have your players invested, because that's the best way to have them kind of create emotional reactions. And if you can make the players have an emotional reaction, the characters are going to have an emotional reaction, and then they're going to role play. So I feel like I maybe went a little bit all over the place there, but if I can quickly summarize, this idea is put them in a space where there's options for them to choose from, and each of those options are going to be different from one another in that it's a character or maybe a quest hook or something. But, build the people of your world. So I still consider this world building, by the way. Build the people of your world, or the people of this village, to enable your players to choose something that will educate you as a game master on how you can hook them in and get them invested.
I love that. Make sense? Yeah, absolutely. Okay. And I love the idea of, however you're skinning those hooks, like in your example, if you're skinning them as a variety of NPCs, what I love about that idea, and this is something I'll start also by saying, I love playing with brand new players. I absolutely love it, because and I've talked to so many DMs who know the spark. They know that moment where a player who's never played a tabletop RPG before, you watch when they get it, and all of a sudden they go, holy crap, like this is, and it's one of the most rewarding things as far as I'm concerned as a DM. I've been playing with my other group for between 15 and 20 years now. There are all sorts of things I love about playing with a seasoned group that really well, but there's something really cool about introducing new players to that space. But what I love that you hit on there is by skinning those quest hooks specifically as kind of these character tropes, you also have a really solid opportunity as a DM to lead by example. And this is not to say, every table handles their RP differently. But if you are a table who, generally speaking, is putting on all the filigree, you have your accents and your mannerisms and obviously you as a DM now have these NPCs who are starkly different from one another, to begin to sit down at the table and go, you don't have to be the first one to do it. You don't have to be the first one to, you'll get an idea of what this looks like before you're expected to jump in. And I think that's something that I've found. I made the mistake at one point of bringing a new group in on this kind of wilderness adventure, and I realized rapidly that I had no great levers to pull. I had to kind of bring those levers into play to give them a sense of what role play looks like at a table. And it's something, if you've played a lot of TTRPGs, it seems pretty second nature. But if you've never played, it's a really difficult thing to describe to someone how that looks, especially with it being a completely different animal. You sit at one table and it's something totally different than it is at another table. So I love that. Sure. I love that framing, and I love establishing that feedback early through those choices to know precisely what palette of colors you're going to be painting with as you unfold this early adventure, whether it's high mystery and sleuthing, or just brutal combat and loot collecting, or
maybe like political intrigue. Who knows? It's you need to at least plant it there for the people at the table to kind of make some kind of decision. Sometimes they have a hard time making the decision as well, and that's fine. But I'm taking a quick look at my notes here, and the reason I'm doing that is because for you to be able to facilitate roleplay through world building, or at least for me to be able to do it, and I'm encouraging others, is it's not really a do this and then you're going to get roleplay. It's more of like a domino effect. But I strongly believe that it starts in the world building. It starts in the space and the people and the factions and the cities. That's where, that's the first domino. And you have to start there to be able to look back and say, oh yeah, this scene where my rogue confronted their enemy and now they're the new leader of this thieves faction. That scene had so much emotional weight because I was able to get them invested in this space And I was able to get them invested in the space because I did X, Y, Z in the world building stages.
Right, right.
And if I may, one of the things that I think people ought to do, and you talked about it a little bit, by having your world building start with problems or conflict.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the steady state of every space you build when you're world building should always be, not always, maybe that's a exaggeration, but oftentimes should be like on a pivot. Like there should be like a balance going on where two factions or two entities are competing for one another, and you have the party come into the middle of this and basically be the deciding factor, right? Like let them weigh in on one of these two sides and hopefully win. And now, boom, you've got investment in this space from that party because they made this space the way it is because of their actions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I love that idea of the party's actions being a swing vote, or in some cases, the party's lack of action. That can be a lesson only need to learn once for parties that maybe are a little more passive or a little more, sometimes they're inaction or just the action of choosing to not get involved, begins to inform players. And this I'll be actually real interested to hear your thoughts on this. Informs players that to some extent, I do think that, especially in the 5th edition space, the games that are playing out, the stories that are unfolding are character-centric stories. In a lot of cases, I don't know that I necessarily agree with this, but in a lot of cases, the world that the characters exist in really does care whether or not those characters exist in it.
Yeah.
As opposed to kind of, I guess this is, I would say, certainly more of an old school thought, but I think this is really a DM to DM thought process. You could also have a world that is completely indifferent about the characters. And I'm not advocating for one extreme over the other, but an example of characters choosing to be inactive or choosing to not be active in a space. From a world building standpoint, one of the things I really like to inculcate into my players is that, choosing to go do quest XYZ whilst this conflict is brewing up, you may come back to that town and it's not the town you remember it because you didn't opt to allow your feelings about that space, your actions in that space to shape it. And a lot of times I will have sideboard roles to help kind of decide those things. If they're not taking a role in it, say a guild war that's going on in a city or an actual war that's playing up in the north or something like that, if they're not actually involved, to kind of track that world, those world events, and go, well, without the parties being active, something's still happening there. So I'd be curious to hear, what are your thoughts? Should worlds, and like I said, I know how subjective this question is, but I'd love to hear your perspective. Should worlds more or less be indifferent to the party? That's not to say that their actions shouldn't have meaning in those worlds, but that the world does not think of the characters as protagonists. It thinks of them as another entity in the world amongst many, many others, and it's up to them to act like protagonists. Or should the world and maybe the narratives that unfold in that space, should they kind of be a little bent towards, these are our heroes, these are our protagonists, and we should to some extent be accommodating them? I'd be really curious to hear your thoughts on that.
I think that's an interesting question. I definitely think it matters, first and foremost, the tone that you and your table are agreeing to, right?
Absolutely.
But let's assume that everybody's okay with anything. The table is happy to do whatever my personal preference is. If that's the case,
man, you are one lucky dungeon master.
yes. You don't let go of that. Don't let go of that table. Again, keep those players forever.
Yeah.
So I think, personally, I'm a fan of telling a story about heroes, and I'm a fan about feeling cool. And when I'm a player, I want to be in the limelight. That doesn't necessarily mean that the world revolves around those characters, though. So I'd like to cheat and say somewhere in between the world not caring and the world, and, and everybody looking at these characters as heroes and everything pauses for them. I certainly am not advocating for either of these two extremities.
Right.
But wherever, I think something that is important to note is all of the advice we've given up until now about world building, especially the one where we were talking about like painting in. I really like that analogy, by the way. Painting in parts of the world as you approach them.
Mm-hmm.
I think people can perhaps interpret that as saying that you do that to the benefit of the party at all cost. That's not what I'm saying, and I'm sure that's not what you're saying.
No, 100%. If that was what was construed, then that was a speaking on a misty. I need a misty step and get myself out of that one. Yeah, but no, I completely. I'm with you 100%. In some cases, it's quite the opposite.
Exactly. So you're painting these things in. You're leaving yourselves these openings to put a challenge, maybe to put something that's going to perhaps get in the way of the hero's journey and give them a setback. So I think, again, it all comes back to world building, right? If you give yourself the structure with the blanks, almost like Mad Lib style, where there's enough blanks that as people approach these things, you can be like, okay, now we need them to kind of feel the burn a little bit and maybe hand them a loss. And I'm not saying I'm not saying that you're going to prescribe losses to your players, but you know what I mean? Like you want to challenge them for that satisfying story arc.
Absolutely.
Well,
absolutely.
That you're going to do that. Your world building is going to be the first step to that, I think.
Yeah.
I have an interesting example of this that happened. It was a while ago now, but, and maybe it's not the best example to follow suit with what I just said, but it was a situation where my players made a decision and kind of had a loss. This was when my party was going to find there was going to be a drop-off point where the big bad guy was going to collect goods. And they were going to collect the goods, and it was going to help them feed their army and take over the world, let's say. Or take over the coast that they were in.
Gotcha.
What ended up happening was my party immediately decided to go there. They were like, this is like, they found out about the drop off. Like, we have to stop this. We have to go make this happen or prevent it from happening to stop the bad guy and his faction from growing stronger.
Right.
But in doing that, they arrived there. There was some interesting exposition that happened and a lot of really bad dice rolls. Like an incredible amount of bad dice rolls. So my party ended up almost dying, failing to stop the drop off, and like kind of wasting their time. Like they came here to do this, to stop this from happening, and chose not to address other problems. But now all of them are going to turn out bad. So it's kind of like the reverse situation where I find myself now in a position where the next place they're going to go to, the next problem they're going to find, I want them to succeed. I want to throw them a bone because the narrative arc of the story, it would maybe be a little bit too harsh if it was another failure, So I'm gonna throw them a situation that hopefully they can get out of, and I'm gonna do that by filling in a blank that exists in a nearby space and putting a conflict there between factions that may or may not already exist in that space.
Right.
Yeah.
No, and I think that does tie, really does tie into this idea. It's another, I guess, kind of another imagery that's beginning to drum up in this conversation of this kind of feedback loop of, and something that I've talked about a lot on my building blocks of a campaign. One of the entire videos is about contrast, and that's contrast of anything, difficult versus easy,
happy, sad, probably.
Happy, sad. The the big crux being that, from session to session, ever since the AP, I've gotten in the habit of saying episode now, and that's not the nomenclature I should be using. From session to session, even right down to if last session you had 2 combats, and they were kind of long, grueling combats, maybe that third combat that you kind of had in the wings doesn't need to play out right now. Maybe there's some, and I think exactly however those other ones played out, maybe they absolutely stomped those other combats. Maybe they got whooped on a little bit. But I absolutely think that, again, that the job of being a DM, and this obviously is as subjective as anything else in the game space, but certainly if why you're sitting in that chair is because you are what I think is a very 5th edition notion, you're sitting down to tell a long form heroic epic with your players. That I think is really what 5th
I think that's pretty standard. I think which is fun and interesting when you think about Dungeons and Dragons at its core being a combat simulator. And I know people are going to get mad at me for saying that, but that's to me, that's how the system is built. It's meant to be this attrition, fight after fight, use your spell slots, use your resources, and slowly, when you find that 6th or 7th fight, now you're in a position where the situation is dire because you don't have any more spell slots, or you've used up all your expendables. But yes, and then that's juxtaposed with this idea that it's going to be this narrative adventure, right? So, anyways, I don't know why I went on that tangent because it doesn't.
But I do. I think it's. I think it contrasts, and I'd say your guess is as good as mine, because I really do think that style of play, this cooperative storytelling centric style of play. I mean, you could almost say, you could sans a huge amount of the game. There are a lot of tables who really what they're interested in doing is sitting down and collectively telling a story. Again, that's between every dungeon master and their players, and every table and their D&D gods or tabletop RPG gods, whatever. But if you are sitting down to do exactly that, sit down and tell an epic story, I think a big part of your job at the table as a DM under those circumstances is reading the table, reading your players, and both from a, what can I put in this little corner of the world that's really going to spice things up, that's going to light a fire under them, or what can I give them right now in their lowest moment in the campaign, where abject failure has fallen upon them. They have never lost so badly. They have never, and if narrative is the consideration, that's just kind of the way the narrative structure works. Something, maybe it's the players themselves need to pick themselves up by the bootstraps, but oftentimes there is some event that is going to aid them in finding that stride again and get them back in that direction. I know that there's going to be a lot of people who disagree with that role as a DM, because there's a lot of different ways of thinking about running the game. But I think in the context of kind of what we're talking about in this very narrative forward space, exactly like what you're saying, the reading of the table from square one and learning what's going to motivate your players, all the way through to knowing when they've had the absolute tar kicked out of them, and like they really, they need this one, guys. Like they need, so yeah, I think, and I think that I completely agree with, I think, your stance in terms of the in-between on whether
I feel like it's a cop out a little bit, because I think maybe you were hoping that I would lean, if I were to lean in a direction, it's towards the heroic. It's towards the world will sometimes find its way to help the players.
Gotcha. Yeah. And I mean, like I said, I just think that's, and I don't think it's a cop out. I mean, if I was asked the question, where I really truly stand is I want a world that doesn't remind the players that they're protagonists at every turn. But I mean, much like you said, I like the epic fantasy narrative forward game. I should say, when I'm sitting down to play 5th edition, if I don't want that experience, there are literally thousands of other systems that will do something different for me. And I don't want to use a hammer to drive a bunch of screws, So when I'm sitting down to play 5th edition with and that is our primary system that we play, that's, I think we exist in pretty similar headspaces with regard to how the world should feel about these particular inhabitants.
But you saying that makes me think of something that I think is advice with regards to roleplay. I actually haven't thought of this before the words are going to come out of my mouth. So we're gonna see. You'll have to humor me.
It's going straight to the internet. Let's do it.
Yeah. But I think one thing that people need to consider when they're world building, if they want to try to facilitate roleplay, is to consider the relationships of the spaces that they're building. I think it's often second nature for people who like narrative-focused games to think of the relationships of characters. That's something that we do a lot, or at least I do a lot. How does my character feel about this? How does that NPC think about that or this? But what if you could abstract that to be a space? And when I say space, maybe maybe faction is a better terminology to use here, but I don't want it just to be people. I think it needs to be this space that we're in. What are the resources that are there? What are the resources that it lacks? What is the geopolitical climate that this space has? And I know it sounds like a lot of heavy stuff, and some people won't be like, that's kind of boring. I don't want to think about that. But I think if you want to think about the relationships of different cities or spaces or continents or any of that kind of stuff, you got to kind of get into the weeds a little bit and start to draw these relationships, be them positive or negative, between the different areas. And I think that might be a way to tap into something if we're trying to consider what kind of roleplay opportunities might present themselves to the players in those environments.
Yeah, 100%. I completely agree. I think, especially starting with kind of our nucleus description of a space, I think I was telling you, I don't know if I start with the conflict first or the space itself first, but you almost just now outlined the exact process that kind of my mind goes through. Is it might start out nucleated, and I might go to a single NPC, and that, just like you said, well, what is this NPC's purpose in this space? Well, is he affiliated with any factions in this space? Is he at odds with any factions? Is he, and if he is, I need to understand what motivates that faction and what other entities have conflicting motivations. And just like you said, I think even though for someone who really gets into that, you can go as far down that rabbit hole as you want to. And I'll second again, because I love the videos. I don't go to this level, but I love thinking about, I should say, consuming Dungeon Masterpieces Geopolitics series for this exact reason, because it's kind of a deep dive on this. But for anyone who isn't really thinking about those aspects, it's not something you have to, bury yourself under piles of textbooks and stuff. I mean, it's, as far as I'm concerned, it can be as simple as, here's this place, who's in it? What are their motivations? What motivations conflict with those motivations? Why do they conflict? And you're almost there just with that. I mean, you've already. I
really like drawing little diagrams where, you think of a space. These are maybe the three main players. You write the three names down, or you put icons, and then you draw arrows. You say this group to that group, positive relationship because they, trade grain, whatever. Arbitrarily come up with something, and then what I like to do is make parity. So if there's a positive relationship going one way, well, the other one has to be a negative one. Let's make that a negative relationship. And why is it a negative relationship? What's the tension there? And then once you finish drawing this little diagram, whether it be a triangle or a square or whatever, now you have the seed of the motivations of the main players in all of these spaces, because you kind of created a mock-up of the relationships of all the groups. And I think one of the beauties of doing this too, and I don't know, Tom, I'd love to hear whether or not you do this, but the beauty of it is once you've set the baseline for yourself and for whether or not it comes out at the table right away is another story. But once you've set that baseline for yourself as the game master, it's really fun to mess with it and to be like, I know that this is the relationship, but what if there were two people that were secretly working together despite the two factions hating each other?
Oh,
and
absolutely.
you create all these different scenarios that are so ripe for role play, because when the players get there, they're going to be surprised. And a surprise is
Absolutely.
another way to get them invested and engaged. And then boom, out comes a really cool scene where they're talking to the character, trying to figure out what's going on, et cetera, et
Right.
cetera.
No, I completely agree. I think taking that exact kind of flow chart that you have just outlined, and something that we've talked about in the context of contrast is players' expectations and confirming or subverting those expectations. And I like, a lot of times we'll like to think about that process of subverting my own expectations, if only for the fact that I have a certain way of thinking about world building, and naturally, I think over time, patterns are going to arise in the way that I create conflicts in the space. So to go back and take it one layer further and go, can I complexify one of these relationships by kind of subverting my own understanding of, and something else I'll say is those subversions, in some cases, I've mentioned this on a number of other interviews that I've done on our channel. In some cases, those subversions are literally coming directly from my players' mouths. They might be, at a tavern going, I don't know, I'm not sure I trust that guy. Like, I just got a bad vibe from him, and I know he's a stand-up guy, but they're going like, oh, well, what if he's actually doing XYZ? Like, he could be involved with, I was gonna pull out a really bad a shady organization name, but we'll just say Shady Organization Incorporated. And I'll be sitting at the table and I'll start going, that's good. Like, I like that. Now I may not just confirm what they're thinking by making that exact guy he's doing all these things that they're ruminating on. But certainly from a world building standpoint, and from when we talk about that feedback loop, something I would encourage people to do. Eventually, they're going to be like, "Stop kicking this dead horse." We know you think you should listen to your players in this capacity, but I think it's something that is criminally under discussed amongst DMs. Is what a potent resource your players' ruminations are at the table, because there have been times where what I have in the works, kind of in the space that I have painted out, their ruminations really start undermining what I thought was going to feel really cool. And I'm going, this is way cooler. Like, what they're talking about right now is just better. I mean, like, I can put my pride on hold. I really want to do something with this. And again, maybe I'll take that and make my own tweaks. Maybe I won't even graft that problem into this town. I may pocket that and use it in a totally different part of the world. But it's something that I would definitely echo. The last thing I wanted to say about that, and I do actually want to pivot over to talk a little bit something a little more pertinent to your main squeeze in the D&D space,
yeah.
but was just on the topic of a world that is ambivalent or agnostic about the players. Those flowcharts, I tend to try and think about those conflicts as being player or character agnostic. But those little threads within them, kind of like you're talking about, like, what about this character who's, obviously the players need to be handed something that interests them in those conflicts. Those conflicts have to be made apparent. But, I think a space in which I've created conflicts where I know I'm creating this conflict knowing that these players are going to show up and engage with it in some capacity. And maybe I even know the quote unquote right way of engaging with it. I really don't like that terminology, but let's just say
the right way for your table, let's say.
Yeah, it might be the way, whether this is just through experience of the way they tend to deal with things, or it might be, you could graft that onto a moral scale. Like, one faction could be, objectively more evil than another faction, and naturally they're gonna. But I try to create those conflicts in a way that if the characters get super involved and super invested, great. Whatever decisions they're making are going to influence the outcome of that conflict. If they don't get invested at all, also great. I mean, that's their prerogative. But that those conflicts, I really, it's like I said, it's something that I would encourage, especially 5th edition DMs, because I think we are in good company in thinking about world building in the way that we've been talking about, and I think it does tend to lend itself to a space that can sometimes, to a fault, acknowledge these characters as the protagonists. And again, that's not to say at level. Oh, go ahead.
I know you wanted to segue away from this, but that's making me think of something, and I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think you don't want the players to feel like they're invulnerable, that they're invincible, right? You want them to feel risk, and the only way for them to fear things is if the risk is real. There needs to be, I think, there needs to be consequences for the actions or the inactions that they take. The world needs to be revolving on its own axis based on the parties that you've populated it with. And I think if you're looking to get a roleplay response out of your players in the world building elements that you're making, if I can summarize most of what I've been trying to say and you've been saying today, I think the really big thing is try to elicit an emotional reaction from the people at your table or the characters that these people are portraying. Because if you can elicit fear or anger or happiness or sadness or whatever, look at some wheel of emotion and try to elicit something based on the way that you've constructed the space and the people in it, then they're going to role play. And if they're not going to, it's because they don't want to, and that's fine. But, if you put in an NPC that they really care about because they've built a relationship with them, or you take their hometown from their backstory and have a dragon burn it to crisp, they're going to have an emotional reaction to that. And that's what's going to fuel the role play is like, how do I react and how does my character move forward? That's going to be the role play right there.
Right. Yeah, 100%. And I think if that role play is tethered to action, I mean, you can be role playing for role playing's sake. And I'll say, I have seen some just unbelievable exchanges, intra-party exchanges around a campfire or whilst downing an ale at the tavern. I mean, stuff that is really kind of telling the story beneath the story if you're talking about a character-centric narrative. But if the role play is attached to actions, that's the only little point that I would add to that is make sure that those actions have meaning in the world. If they're engaging, and no matter what they do, no matter how much they're engaged with, no matter how much they care about what it is they're doing, and if it's just like, well, I've kind of already decided this is the way I wanted things to play out, so sorry guys, I don't think anything is more antithetical to eliciting that emotional response than players feeling as though they can't get off the rails that a DM has placed them on. And I know that's not new information to anybody. I mean, that's like DM 101. Mm-hmm. But I think in little subtle ways that may not be the blatant, no matter where you go, this NPC's showing up to talk to you. It doesn't matter, you can, there's no getting away from him. He doesn't have to be that blatant. But it can also, manifest sometimes as actions not having the weight that they should be imparting into the world. And part of that just, again, comes down to, I think, reading that table. I want to pivot now, we'll still be staying in the same space, but you kind of find yourself in the very privileged position, I think, of being able to sit down give us a real quick as we lead into this, for anyone who's here on Modern Myth who isn't familiar with what you are doing over on your podcast, give them a really brief rundown of what that looks like. And then through that lens, because you have the advantage of having picked many a DM's brain on a lot of different subjects, I think I want to hit on some of this stuff and just see if any of those conversations, or I should say, what portions of those conversations maybe have influenced your own way of thinking about these things. So give everyone who's watching right now just a real quick idea of who you are and what you're doing over on Roleplay Chat.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'm Matt, and like I like to say at the beginning of every episode, I'm a game master who can't stop talking about role-playing games. So today's conversation is just more of me talking about role-playing games, I guess. And by the way, thank you so much.
Terrible affliction. It is a terrible affliction, man. I'll tell you what. No, I'm really glad that we were able to line up. I know scheduling has been a little bit it's always tough, it just is what it is, but I'm glad we were able to line up and get after this. But sorry, I don't want to derail you there.
Yeah, so real quick, Roleplay Chat, it's a podcast where me and a guest, every episode, we basically give advice. It's a D&D tabletop RPG advice podcast. We pick a topic every episode, and we just dissect it. We get philosophical, we go into the weeds, we give examples, and we share the things that have worked for us and the things that we think are good recommendations for people to try. I've had the blessing of getting to talk to all kinds of wonderful people, from people getting started in the space, tabletop RPG designers that have created independent games, to some of the people that I consider to be some of my heroes in the space. I had the privilege of talking to Brennan Lee Mulligan for 3 hours. It was amazing. He gave me, he is one of the most insightful people, I think, in the space that does this professionally. So that was absolutely really nice. And Seth Skorkowski is another who I think is just full of nuggets of gold whenever he talks about his games. He's more of a Call of Cthulhu guy, and he likes that kind of grim, gritty
Eldritch horror kind of vibe, which I can appreciate. I love that tone. Under the right circumstances, I guess.
So that's the show. Every other week, an episode comes out. It's Roleplay Chat wherever you listen to podcasts. And the conversation, if you guys like these kinds of DM and the PM type of conversations and you want more of it, Roleplay Chat is a similar vibe. And actually, Tom's going to be joining me for an episode eventually, once we can line our schedules up to do that. So it's
the scheduling dance that never seems to end. But I would highly recommend anyone who is checking this out. If all of that was new for you, you are in for a treat, because tons and tons of great content over there. So definitely get over there and check that out. I don't want to derail us too much. What I want to know, I guess, right out of the gate here is, no doubt you, before being in the podcast space and kind of having the opportunity to have those conversations, had a certain way of thinking about the game, had a certain way of thinking about world building and role playing and the Venn diagram where those overlap. How has that changed? Given all the conversations that you've had, do you think it's changed dramatically, or give me a little bit of a sense of kind of what that journey has been like, and remind me again how long you were kind of in. Correct me if I'm wrong. The third season right now.
So Roleplay Chat's been going for a little over 3 years now. So there's a lot of content there in the backlog, and every episode's independent. So find the ones that you like. But yeah, it's been a long journey. The show has, if I can go behind the curtain a little bit, has changed a little bit over time. It started off with me and my co-host Chris, and we just talked to the two of us. But then things, life as it gets in the way, Chris decided to take a back seat and stepped away from the show. And then I found myself still wanting to have these conversations with people. So that's how I found myself in a position of asking people to come and join me for the conversations.
Very cool.
So I would say that at first, when it was just me and Chris, it was more of, I'm going to keep sinking into my old habits because I need to defend them, and he would defend his, and we'd kind of not butt heads, but we would try to present two sides of the same coin.
Spar a little bit. Friendly. Yeah.
But then once people started joining me on the show and I started letting them get the limelight and talk about their positions, kind of like you're gracefully letting me do on your show, I'd find myself considering what they'd have to say and being like, that's such a good point. Why don't I try to do that? So 100%, I think I've changed a lot. One of the things, if if I can get ahead of myself here, one of the things that I think I really changed on the most, one of the things that I pivoted into the most was I used to think, and I'm sure people are going to cringe when I say this, but I used to think that funny things and serious things did not belong together. Maybe because I didn't have enough confidence in myself as a game master to kind of flow between these two states.
Yeah, we weave them together, and it's not always an easy thing to shift your weight in that capacity.
Yeah. So it was, it was something that it took Brennan to tell me straight to me, you can combine these two things together, and in fact, you need to. And his advice was basically that you're not gonna, and it makes a whole lot of sense when you hear it this way, and other people have said it before. You can't appreciate one without the other. You can't have the high without the low, because you can't contrast them together. And as long as you're sending the right signals to the table, and it's the right people at the table, they're going to be able to appreciate that this is a funny scene, but then it's not going to be funny anymore. Like, you have to send the signals, and the players at the table have to be able to receive those signals to shift and have that tonal dissonance.
Well, I think if anyone was ever worthy of being heard in that advice, it's got to be Brennan. I mean, I think especially when I go to think of, his broader body of work, I think has always had a comedic undertone. And I know when I watched him run Calamity, it was such a step outside of that space. And for me, that was the moment. I mean, I think anyone who's ever seen him, you watch him run the game for 2 minutes, you go, this guy is putting on a master class in terms of doing what he does. He does it really well. The range when he was running Calamity, that's for me really something that solidified in my mind exactly that point. Is I think there was a lot of people, myself included, who, when it was announced that he was going to be the guest DM, thought they had pegged exactly what that experience was going to look and feel like. And that subversion of expectation was so potent that, I think that the idea of needing one to appreciate the other and vice versa is, he has so adequately manifests that in that exchange. So I really like that. I don't think I've seen that episode. Heard that episode.
Go find it.
I need to go drum it up. No doubt. So if I don't want to interrupt you, if you've got more to say on kind of how that's changed, and maybe I'm about to get the same answer given what you just told me, but is there, throughout all the guests that you've had, was there a moment in which someone laid some advice on you, and you just went, I've never thought about it this way, I've never implemented that, but as you're hearing it, you're just going, this is like, I can't even believe that this wasn't the way I've always done it. And like I said, don't feel like it's a cop out if you go like, yeah, I just said it. It was Brennan. but I'm just curious, because you've had many guests, and I've heard some really interesting perspectives over on your podcast. So it is, and it doesn't have to be just one, but I mean, can you drum up any examples of times in which you just went, wow, that advice is just, it's totally catching me off guard, and it's 100%. It's it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if I can say with certainty that it caught me completely off guard because of who the guest was, but I not too long ago spoke to David Tilstra of the From Afar podcast. David and his cast, everybody on there is wonderful. They have an actual play podcast that the folks can listen to, and they stream their games. So yeah, From Afar podcast. And Dave is a wonderful, wonderful person, and he really leans in to that dramatic and really leans into the rule of cool. And we had a conversation just about that, about the rule of cool, and kind of this ability to suspend one's disbelief just enough to believe what's happening, but without necessarily breaking the immersion of the game and making sure that everybody stays in the fantasy land or the sci-fi land or whatever, in the world that you're in.
Right.
And David told me a story about this one time where one of the player characters found themselves in hell or some like version of it. And the character was a berserker who for a long period of time had never gone into rage. But because they now find themselves in one of the circles of hell in front of a demon that killed somebody important to them, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly, they killed somebody important to this character. David basically let this person go into full berserk mode and have like attack after attack after attack after attack, completely breaking the rules of the game because they were playing Dungeons and Dragons, completely breaking the rules of the game to have this character have a moment and allow this character to like really reap the role play seed that they planted by not going into their rage for such a long period of time. And when he explained that to me, I was like, I thought I understood the rule of cool. I didn't know you could take it this far and still have it pay off. And maybe there's people listening who are like, that's too far. I would never go there. And that's fine. That's okay. But in my head, I thought I understood what the rule of cool was. I didn't think it was like so blatantly changing the rules of the game. And I'm saying this with as much praise as I can, like pushing the limits of what I thought was acceptable and being like, you know what? I would do that too. Like now that I know that that's something that I could consider doing, given the right circumstances, I might implement it. So I thought that was a pretty neat conversation.
Yeah, no doubt. And I do think, what you hit on leading into that about the tightrope of implementing the rule of cool. If you're a DM who likes to lean into those kind of bombastic moments and really allow them to flourish into something, it doesn't take too far of stepping off that line before everyone at the table goes like, oh, so I guess there's just no rules at all anymore, and it's easy to break that immersion. Yeah. Do you recall and I'm right along with you. I have listened to that episode, but I don't recall. Was the Berserker alone in that space?
I believe they were. I believe it was just them.
I thought they. Yeah,
but I could be wrong. It's been a while.
Yeah, but the only reason I bring that up is because I think. That as this kind of I'm thinking kind of in a cinematography sense, but as this kind of close-up shot between this berserker and this demon, devil, what have you, this infernal entity, a close-up of that really manifesting and getting this rule of cool payoff for this cool RP moment is a very different animal if there's 4 other players standing there going like, I guess I'll hit him with my club on my turn and okay, next turn. I mean, like, so I think that there is so much to be said for executing that rule of cool, finding opportunities where the rest of the table can be as invested in the breaking of those rules because it's not dumping on them to do so, and so I love that. That's
and if I can try to bring that back, if we can look at world building, I think one of the beauties of world building is that, I mean, there aren't really rules. I don't think. Of course, you can look at like actual physical geography of our world and try to mimic that and use like Köppen classification climate zones or whatever, but at the end of the day, you're playing your game in a world that you're creating. And I think if there is a place where you can implement the rule of cool with perhaps a little less consequence to system rules, the world that you're in is the perfect place to do that.
100%.
Right? 100%. Like go lean heavy. You're in the middle of a desert, but you want to have some kind of magical snow dome, whatever. You can find a way to make that happen and still make it cool. And realistic.
100%. And I think that, there's going to be a lot of low fantasy listeners out there who are going to go like, no, that's not what I. And that's the thing, is that they very likely are not a big fan of the concept of rule of cool to begin with, because it kind of betrays that grounded sense, or certainly can betray it. But if you are really leaning into that high fantasy, you pull out all the stops, make your worlds, crazy inverted gravity places, and whatever, you just go wild. Technically speaking, they're really, like you said, there's no rule telling you can't or even shouldn't do that, so obviously that's for every table to kind of suss out, and to the same point, kind of reading your table. Is this going to,
and challenge yourself? Like if you're listening and you're saying that's never going to happen in my table because my world's internal consistent rules wouldn't enable it to, that's okay. I'm not saying that you have the wrong opinion, but what I am saying is try to challenge your opinion. Try to see if the world that you're in does have an ability for there to be something kooky or wacky to happen that's unexpected to the party. Because up until this point, I'm sure that they've learned the rules of the world that they're playing in. Try to throw them in for a spin. Maybe there's some kind of loophole that you can exploit as the creator of this world, or as the person behind the screen, kind of weaving it together to make something at the very least unexpected happen. Because again, that's what's going to elicit an emotional reaction from the people at your table. That's what's going to make them roleplay.
Yeah, no, I love it, man. We always kind of on the show, as we both said this when we were kicking this off, that this is a rabbit hole. I think neither of us are short for words, especially when it comes to the Dungeons and Dragons space. So I know that we could go forever, and maybe we'll even have an opportunity to sit down and crunch on another topic. I'd love to be able to get together, or I guess at least we'll be crunching on a topic over on your side of the space at some point here. But I do also, I always like to kind of round out, leave a little bit of space in these episodes for whoever's coming on to. I know you've already kind of talked a little bit about the podcast, but I know that you can be invested in a lot of different things. So I'd like to leave a little space to really just kind of hand you the mic, which figuratively speaking.
Sure, yeah, I got it.
You've got it. And really just, what are you hyped about right now? What's going on with, what should people be thinking about? This is just your few minutes to give everyone out there an idea of why they should be checking you out on social media, checking you out on the podcast, maybe checking you out in other endeavors that are on the horizon.
Yeah, well, I want to thank you first and foremost, Tom, for having me here. This has been a lot of fun, and like you said,
absolutely,
I could go on forever. So yeah. I'm happy to do this anytime, and I'm looking forward to having you on Roleplay Chat to talk about.
I can't wait. It's going to be a good time.
Yeah. So if people listening or watching enjoy these kinds of deep dive philosophical conversations, I'd encourage you to come find Roleplay Chat. That's ROLE as in roleplay. And yeah, it's a advice podcast where me and a different guest every week, or every other week, because the show is bi-weekly, we pick a topic, we dissect it, we give our advice, we give our recommendations, we give our stories and anecdotes, and try to share some insights that have worked at our tables, and maybe that'll work at yours. The show, like I said, is quite long. There's about 3 years worth of content there, but don't feel obligated to listen to everything. Every episode is independent from the other, so you can just go find a topic or a guest that you think resonates with you, or maybe something in your particular creative, in your DMing creative process. You're like, right now I'm thinking about traps. Go find the episode about traps. Right now you're thinking about how to implement consequences properly. Go find the episode about consequences.
Yeah. And I love catalogs like that myself, because that's when I'm in a headspace. That's what I want to consume. I want to consume it. I want to get thoughts on it. I want to get, so I love that. And all of that information, all the links, your social media, the podcast, all that you'll find down in the description. So you don't have to worry about any misspellings when you're getting over there. Just jump down there, tag that link so you can get over there and enjoy a bunch more of that content. You got any final thoughts before we wrap this thing up, brother?
Well, I just want to get on my
I know
horse
you've
or my
got many.
soapbox
I know
again.
you've got many.
I'll
But
just say it real quick.
yeah,
If you want your world to facilitate role play, people, you need to. Let me start over. If you want your world to facilitate role play at your table, the best way to do so is to facilitate emotional response from your players and or their characters or both. Get them invested. That's probably the easiest way to do it. Get them invested in the space that they're playing in. Get them invested in the world or the characters that play the cast of that story, and then you're gonna have role play. So
beautiful.
So yeah. So thanks again, Tom, for having me. And if folks want to come find me, that's at roll_play_chat on Twitter and Instagram. And that's
there you
it.
go.
Yeah.
Sweet. Those links will also be in the description. We've got a little tradition here over at Modern Myth. And if you would help me out with this one, Matt, we sign off all of our videos here with the phrase, "The world is yours." So I'm going to take us out and then I'm going to pass it over your way. And if you would give us the most Matt from Roleplay Chat, "The world is yours," that you can muster, make it your own, do whatever you want with it. Thank you guys so much for joining us this time. I really do hope you enjoyed that episode here with Matt from Roleplay Chat, talking about world building and the ways in which we can make those worlds fertile places for roleplay to naturally grow in. But we really do appreciate you guys joining us this time. Until next time.
The world is yours, friends.